Alrighty, thank you, Mark. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker of the morning. He's the VP of Global Community at Unreasonable Group. It's a private global network investment fund and media company. They provide resources to social entrepreneurs that are solving the world's problems. And he manages teams that support more than 150 growth equity companies, and they operate in 180 countries. They've generated $1.5 billion in revenue and $2 billion they've raised in financing. They're positively impacting the lives of more than 440 million people worldwide. But wait, there's more. Prior to joining Unreasonable Group in 2017, he retired as a colonel from the U.S. Air Force after a distinguished 25-year career as a special operations advisor, a helicopter pilot, and international affairs strategist. He operated in more than 60 countries and led multinational task forces in multiple combat theaters. He has learned 4 languages and advised senior American and foreign government executives on security and counterterrorism strategies. He was awarded the Bronze Star, the Aerial Achievement Medal, and the Defense Distinguished Service Medal. I told you, these guys are amazing. Please join me in welcoming Josh Burgess.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and special thanks to Diana and the organizers of the event for putting on such a terrific show. Thank you for sharing this time with me today. But I have to pause for just a second for one more special thank from one retired public servant to another soon-to-be Chief Hayes White. Thank you and congratulations for all of your tremendous service and dedication. You know, in May, when you take off that uniform for the last time and hang it in the closet, it's kind of a surreal feeling. It will be bittersweet, but it's a wonderful opportunity that I shared a year and a half ago to actually look back and reflect a bit on the lessons learned in a long career of service, of leadership, and try to figure out what it all means moving forward. Now, I served, as you heard a little bit, amongst the incredible men and women of U.S. Special Operations Command as a special operator, leading sometimes those forces in extremely complex environments with classified missions. We're not a lot of storytellers. In fact, it's a community known as the quiet professionals, which begs the question, what am I doing up here? Well, I'm also a pilot. And as any of you know, if you know any aviators, given the opportunity to tell war stories, we can't keep our mouths shut. In fact, there's always kind of a trigger that you'll note when a story is about to come from a pilot. Usually it will involve striking kind of a heroic pose, maybe the hands lifted up depicting feats of aerial brilliance. And usually it starts with the phrase, "No shit, there I was." So we'll get to that a little bit later. But there's also a more solemn agreement, a covenant between the audience and the storyteller. You all agree to remain absolutely riveted on every word that I say, okay, deal there. And I, in turn, pledge that I will adhere strictly to the 10% rule, which says that at the very least, 10% of what I say will be 100% true. So not worry about the math on that right now. But that's in reflecting backwards. Now, the same opportunity, Chief, will be availed to you of looking forward and trying to figure out, well, what comes next? How can I take those leadership experiences and try to form some sort of new purpose in life, address the challenges that are out there. And as we've heard, there is no shortage of challenges to be addressed. Change is ever present. It's a good and bad thing. But what I've noticed in my time in government is that it's the pace of change that is incredibly different right now. This is what's creating greater challenges for governments, for businesses. That pace of change that's coming from the exponential growth in information flow, the exponential growth in access to information, disruptive technologies, forming the velocity of human interaction that is almost impossible to keep up with as a leader. So how do we do that then? How do we take a system that's built upon almost being reactive rather than proactive and flip the script a bit? When we look at the challenges that are facing us because of that, we need to look no further than what we talked about earlier today, the future of work. The idea that, according to the World Economic Forum, by the year 2030, 60% at least of the jobs that exist today will no longer exist. That means that we're going to be required to make very fundamental shifts in how we educate children who are coming up now, but we're also going to have to reskill. Most of us in this room are going to have to learn some new skills that we don't know right now in order to fit into the workforce in the future. That will require a resilience. How do we build that resilience to react to these rapid changes in the systems that we know and love? But at the same time, there are greater ecological changes that are taking place that are even more challenging to keep up with in some cases. When you look at population growth, at climate change on a global level, these are challenges that leave us in some cases on our heels. Oxfam recently released a report that said by the year 2050, almost 10 billion people will live on the face of the earth, increasing our global food requirements by 60%. That at a time when some of our existing food systems, like take the meat industry, are releasing up to 15% of the global greenhouse gases that are then exacerbating the system and continuing on that way. So how do we then take a different kind of adaptability and flip the script on these centuries-old problems and systems to create new ones that get ahead of the game? That's going to take leadership, and it's going to take the leadership that comes from this room. You know, I also read a study on the way out here that said, I think there's a McKinsey study that said that the Bay Area now has the 19th biggest economy on the face of the earth by GDP, which is phenomenal. It's incredible, and it affords you tremendous opportunities, but it also levies upon you a massive responsibility to lead, not just locally, but globally. So to look at some of this adaptability coming from a military career, that's something that everyone in the military can attest to. Adaptability is something that is pressed upon you time and time again throughout a career. And it brings to mind a story. No shit, there I was. On a cold, cloudy, moonless night at the controls of a foreign military helicopter flying low and slow over a rugged mountain ridge line. The rhythmic thump of the rotor blades overhead, the green glow of the night vision goggles and the green filtered cockpit lights, creating almost a hypnotic effect. When suddenly, boom, a shock wave shudders through the frame of the aircraft. We're shot forward. I can feel myself sort of careening downward. And I don't know how many of you have been in a situation similar to this, but there's a physiological response that occurs that's called temporal distortion. Time either maybe speeds up for you, for some others it slows down dramatically. For me in this case, it seemed to sort of just turn time and space into this sort of slowly molding thing and just offered me sort of a chance to reflect a little bit on just what was going on and what had got me there. I was part of a multinational task force of peacekeepers interdicting weapons and drug flow across a disputed international border in an attempt to stop war from breaking out. Unfortunately, our adversaries knew that we were hovering along at night trying to figure out where they were trafficking weapons, so they had started to put mines in all of the clearings along the paths that our ground forces would take. What we didn't know is they were also putting anti-tank mines in the trees, tying it to fabric so that when we hovered over, our rotor wash would lift it up, trigger the mine. We found out later, spoiler alert, that the shrapnel did not actually catch the aircraft for the most part. But that shock wave had sent us careening forward in a way that you do not want to be in a helicopter, almost upside down, kind of hanging from my restraints. My night vision goggles had been knocked askance. So now I'm blind, and I'm hearing the warning signals going off. I'm seeing that sort of healthy glow of the cockpit lights has now changed to a Christmas tree of red and orange. I can hear the very calm voice of my cockpit companion telling me all of the operating limits that we've exceeded. Meanwhile, in the back, I can hear the flight engineer saying calmly, "Pull back, sir, pull back." So I had to start figuring out how I'm going to lead my way out of this and adapt on the fly. First choice was to say to my co-pilot, "You have the controls, I'm blind." So he took the controls. I flipped my goggles back down. I can see that he's now deftly steering us away from a cliff that was in front of us. There's a golden rule in an aviation emergency that says you have to do three things: aviate, navigate, and communicate. It's pretty important to do them in that order, otherwise things get a little bit hairy. So he's just aviated us out of the problem. Now we're flying straight and level, and we can begin to assess the situation a bit more. Next is navigate. According to our checklist, with this incredible myriad of emergencies that we have going on, we need to get on the ground immediately. Unfortunately, we know that there are mines all over the place, so we decide that that is not in our best interest, and we decide to go to our alternate plan. So we're already to our backup plan. Another thing you should know about special operations is that we don't consider one backup plan to be just enough. In fact, you need to have 4 at the very least built into every plan. There's an acronym for that we call PACE: primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. Backups to the backups to the backups, because we know that the old adage is true: even the best of plans doesn't survive first contact with the enemy. So now we decide, in the interest of navigating, we will continue to go back. We're actually going to try to return to our home base so that we can land somewhere safe where we're not going to make our situation even worse. But to do that, we have to fly with an aircraft that is in seriously bad shape. Next comes communicate. We need to tell someone what's happened, let them know in case we have to make a crash landing so they know where we are. But our tactical satellite communications are down. Our VHF radio is broken. Looks like the UHF isn't working either. So suddenly we're into the emergency plan, which we didn't really have necessarily. So we're making it up now and adapting on the fly. I asked the guy in the back if he could get out his cell phone, and miraculously he got a signal. So he called base ops. He can't hear them, but they could hear him telling him where we were, what speed we were going, what direction, so they'd know where to start looking if we didn't make it back. Now on the way back home, we're dealing with cleaning up the emergencies in the list. Of course, inevitably something else goes wrong. There's smoke in the cockpit. We have to deal with that. We deal with a number of other emergencies, but in the end, we make it back and onto the ground. And now comes the after-action report and the lessons learned to figure out something that is transferable beyond just an aircraft emergency into the situation I think we're discussing today, which is building in those plans ahead of time is absolutely critical when we know that the plan is uncertain, that the future is uncertain, and that things are going to change. We have to build that in ahead of time. But what about that other part where we know that systems on a global level are failing, and we need to work on those as well? Well, that's when I got out of the military. I decided I wanted to find something that was going to address the bigger issues in a more proactive way. You heard about Unreasonable Group, what we do, supporting entrepreneurs in the social and environmental realm globally. An incredible, incredible spirit and vision that exists among them. In fact, there's one in particular, though. We've got a number of fellows from the Unreasonable community who are in the Bay Area, surprise. And I'd like to talk about one in particular today. And I've been struggling with this. This is a game time decision. I was going to totally co-opt his story and pretend it was me, but the 10% rule would not allow me to do that. It would have been just a little bit on the wrong line. A friend of mine whose name is Uma Valetti. Well, we'll try this out. No shit, here he was. Standing in the center of a brightly lit surgical room, surrounded by the hum and beep of monitors, ventilator, a team of expert doctors and nurses and technicians around him. And Uma is at the center of it all because he's a cardiologist who's about to perform a procedure on a patient that is somewhat revolutionary. It's taking tissue that has been grown from that individual's stem cells, grown in a lab, and putting it back into the patient to help repair damaged tissue from a heart attack. This is something that at the time was absolutely revolutionary and changes the way we can deal with preventative medicine as well. Now, how cool is Uma? Because as he was performing this procedure, he's kind of doing the temporal distortion thing and thinking about, what if we could do other stuff? If we're growing this tissue in a lab, why don't we grow other meat in a lab, meat from animals? In fact, what got this patient in this problem to begin with was in part brought on by an unhealthy diet. As I alluded to earlier, the meat industry, and not to pick on it, but has some shortcomings on the impact it has upon our global environment, on the impact it has on global health and public health, with the proliferation of drug-resistant bacteria, the amount of land and water that's taken in growing the cattle and other animals for the industry. So all these thoughts are going through Uma's mind at this time. Let's fast forward a little bit. He takes that thought, realizes that perhaps it would be possible to raise edible, consumable meat in a lab. And today, he's the co-founder and CEO of a company called Memphis Meats that is a pioneer in the clean meat industry, and it's right here in the Bay Area. In fact, Uma's joined us here today. a spectacular story. Some of you who are entrepreneurs may have noticed that I skipped a couple steps in there between the idea and a company that's doing fabulously well. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to be an entrepreneur. Oma's no stranger to that. He overcame a lot of challenges. He was born and raised and went to medical school in India, had to overcome all of the bureaucratic hurdles to come to the US and study at the Mayo Clinic, become a very forward-looking cardiologist and member of the American Heart Association. And just when his practice is really humming, he has this idea that he can't get out of his mind. And from there, he starts to have the conversations. Well, someone surely is doing something about this. Turns out a lot of people thought the idea was great, but no one was really willing to make the leap. And so Uma did. It meant a lot of personal sacrifice, but he took the chance. That is the kind of adaptability that looks at flipping global systems on their head and creating a sustainable future. So when we look at those two types of adaptability, it's really about how those lead to progress in my mind. I didn't tell you where the name for Unreasonable Group comes from. Many of you will be familiar with a quote by the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw that says, "The reasonable person adapts themselves to the world, whereas the unreasonable person persists in trying to adapt the world to themselves. Therefore, all progress depends upon unreasonable people." Well, with all due respect to George Bernard Shaw, one of my favorite playwrights, I would argue that it actually takes both. And we've seen that on the one side, building resilience so that you can meet the changes that come is critical. Uma has shown us that it's possible and vital to get ahead of the game and ensure that we can undo some of the damage that we're doing and get ahead of the problem so you don't have to react as much. And then what happens with the rest of you? Look, these global challenges are not going to go away. The pace of change is only going to keep increasing. I would say that as a former member of our federal government, that national governments, international organizations have an inconsistent history of dealing well with these types of challenges. And that's where it comes down to you all. With such an incredible array of opportunities ahead of you. You know, I think about this adaptability question almost from a mathematical stance as a pilot. I look at the adaptability of resilience, we'll call that A sub R, the adaptability of sustainability, A sub S. A sub R plus A sub S equals P, that's progress. And to get there, you need to have unreasonable leadership. And I believe that you here in the room today and those with whom you work and live on a daily basis will have a decisive role to play in building a sustainable future with an economic strength collectively that's greater than 175 other countries in the world, with a rich history of progressive civic leadership, and with, I don't know, tens of thousands of courageous visionaries like Uma living right here in the Bay Area. What a great opportunity, and simultaneously, what a great responsibility to lead, not just locally, not just nationally, but globally and unreasonably. I'd like to end on a quote. When faced with the decision of whether to continue with a very lucrative and rewarding job as a cardiologist and probably change positively the lives of thousands over the course of his career, or to take a massive leap and try something different, try something that just might positively change the lives of billions. Last thing Uma did when making this decision was to consult with his family, and his children asked what I asked you then today. If you don't do it, who will? Thank you.